A long, long time ago, in the great kingdom of Persia, there existed an embittered king named Shahryar. After learning that his wife had been cheating on him, the king's heart became shrouded in a veil of resentment, and he vowed to unleash his wrath on every woman in the kingdom. Being the king came with its own privileges. He simply ordered all unmarried women to be brought to his court so that he could wed with a new woman each night. Afraid of fate repeating itself, the king ordered his newlywed wife to be executed in the morning, never to have someone cheat on him ever again. The days went by as families surrendered their daughters to the king, coming to terms with the fact that they would never see them again, until it came to Scheherazade, the vizier's daughter's turn to yield to her fate. She was a young, witty woman, and she refused to have her life taken from her for a crime she never even committed. Alas, what power did a frail woman have when pitted against the king of a great empire? Perhaps an infinite amount, if she could put her smart wits to use. After her wedding to the king, she was brought to his bedroom to spend one last night with her husband before being swept by winds of oblivion in the morning. Slowly, she began to set her plan in motion. She asked the king if he would like to hear a story, and the king decided to go along with it, not having high expectations. Scheherazade began telling her husband such a gripping story that the king simply couldn't wait for it to finish. However, being the witty woman she was, she stopped the story right before the end, telling the king that she would only finish it the next night. Having fallen victim to his own curiosity, the king ordered to postpone the execution of Scheherazade until hearing the end of her story, and that day wouldn't come sooner than 1001 nights. After hearing story after story for nearly 4 years, the king realized that he'd fallen deeply in love with Scheherazade, and his vengeful heart had finally found peace. He ultimately decided to spare the life of the woman he loved and spend the rest of his days ruling the great empire with his new queen.
A long time ago, when legends and stories were a favorite pastime of the people, there lived a poor fisherman with his family. The man had made a strange pact with himself, and that was to never cast his net upon the sea more than 4 times. Some days, fish were scarce, and other days, abundant. However, the fisherman and his family had taught themselves to be content with whatever fate provided, and they lived a simple but happy life. One day, as the fisherman was looking for prey in the vast sea, it seemed like his luck had run out. When he cast his net for the first time, he found nothing but a heavy carcass of a dead mule. The second time, he found only a jar full of stone and mud, and the third time, he found broken pieces of glass. He cast his net for the final time while praying that he could find some kind of food to bring back to his family, knowing full well that if not, then that night they would have to sleep on empty stomachs. After an hour, when it came time to pull the net out, he found a heavy and ornate cask with a beautiful gem on top. The man pried open the cask, and a strange stream of dust scattered in the air. As the fisherman watched everything unfold in bewilderment, a big genie manifested out of the dust particles. As the genie laid its eyes upon the man, a smile appeared on its face. The genie explained that it had been imprisoned for many centuries for disobeying King Solomon, and that it had promised to reward its savior by bringing an end to his life in any way he wished. Chills went down the fisherman's spine as the genie ordered him to think of a way to end his life, and he remembered his family who were waiting impatiently for his return home. The fisherman's memories started to flash before his eyes as cold sweat ran down his forehead, as if in his last moments before death. However, he suddenly had a revelation. He realized that if he could put his brain to good use, then he could outsmart the genie and save his own life. He thought of an ingenious plan on the spot. He asked the genie how in the world such an enormous creature could fit into such a small cask. The genie, elated at having its ego stroked, smirked and turned himself into dust. The instant the particles rushed inside the cask, the fisherman grabbed its lid and sealed the cask with the beautiful gem. As the genie screamed inside the cask and demanded to be let out, the fisherman dragged it towards the sea and threw it back into the waves of oblivion.
Once upon a time, in the ancient land of Persia, there lived a Greek king, one of Alexander the Great's successors, who suffered from a skin condition which no physician had ever been able to cure. As days went by, the king's condition worsened and patches started to appear on his skin. It seemed as though the foreboding shadow of death hanging upon his head grew stronger with each hour that passed. As the king lived his days with fear, a man named Sage Ruyan happened to pay a visit to the king's city. The man was a well-known physician, and he could speak several languages. Once he learned about the king's condition, he immediately went to his palace and told the king that he could heal him without even feeding him a drop of medicine. The king couldn't believe his ears, but he told the sage that he would reward him handsomely if he could. The sage went home, only to return the next day with a strange ball and a bat. He told the king to hit the ball with the bat until sweat started to drip from his body. Some sort of workout for the king. Then, once he took a bath and got a good night's rest, there would be no sign of illness on his body by the time he wakes up. The king did as the sage had instructed and slept like a log until the sun rose in the morning. Surprisingly, the king woke up with a glowing body and a giant smile on his face. His illness had been no more, and he was once again a healthy man. The king kept his word and rewarded Sage Ruyan with a warm welcome and chests full of money and gifts. However, his benevolence was not without its consequences. The king's minister became green with envy and decided to plot against the wise doctor. The minister approached the king and snarked that the man the king valued dearly is simply an enemy of his, sent to do his master's bidding. Much to his dismay, the king immediately realized the minister's vile plan and shunned him away. He declared that no enemy of his would cure this illness that none had been able to heal, and that the minister was simply jealous of the sage's wisdom. He said that the minister simply wished for him to order the sage's death on a whim and to make him feel regret, just like the story of King Sinbad and his eagle. But this story remains for the next episode. In the ancient times, there lived a king named Sinbad in the Middle East. King Sinbad loved to hunt and travel, but most of all, he loved his pet falcon. He never separated from his falcon for a second, and he always drank water from a small golden bowl that had been tied around the falcon's neck. One day, the king went hunting with his falcon and servants, and the party caught a deer. The king ordered his men to surround the prey, and if anyone were to let the deer run, then they would have to yield to a fate of death. The king had thought his prey a weak and mindless animal, but he was gravely mistaken. The deer ran towards the king and with a mighty leap escaped the king's clutch. It took a few moments for the consequences of the deer's escape to dawn upon the king. He realized that if he couldn't recapture the animal, then he would fall victim to his own orders. The king and his falcon rushed after the deer, and when they came upon the animal, the king ordered his falcon to attack the deer. With its help, the animal fell victim, and soon its head was hung from the king's horse as a sign of victory. However, the hunt had taken its toll on the king's body, and he began to feel parched. Seeking refuge in the shadows of a tree, he saw drops of water dripping down its leaves. As if having found an oasis in the middle of a desert, he quickly grabbed his golden bowl from the falcon's neck and proceeded to drink the drops of water. However, the falcon flapped its wings, causing water to spill from the bowl. The king, believing that perhaps his falcon was thirsty as well, filled the bowl once more and put it next to the bird, only for the previous scenario to repeat. After witnessing the falcon's strange behavior for the third time, the king's bafflement gave rise to anger, and in the blink of an eye, the bird lost its life to the sharp blade of King's sword. At that moment, the king's eyes fell upon the top of the tree, and he saw a big, poisonous snake coiled on top as drops of venom dripped from its fangs. Realizing his grave mistake, an immense feeling of regret washed over the king, but it was already too late. Back in the Greek king's court in the previous episode, the minister shook his head as he listened to the king recite this story. He told the king that he feared for his life, just as the deceitful minister had to face his death when he decided to deceive the king's son. He began to tell the Greek king about this story, but that one is reserved for another day.
The Greek king's minister began reciting the story of a prince whose biggest passion in life was to hunt. One day, he and the king's vizier, who'd grown tired of the prince's antics, went hunting. When the party came across a beautiful deer, the vizier asked the prince to chase after it, while he himself stayed back with a devious grin on his face. The prince rushed after the deer on his horse, unable to see anything but the prey in front of his eyes. As he rode further into the forest, he lost sight of the deer, realizing that he was lost. At that moment, in one corner of the forest, he encountered a young girl shedding silent tears. After learning that her situation was not much different from his own, the prince felt sorry for the young girl and decided to take her along. The two journeyed on the back of his horse for a while until the girl asked him to stop. As the girl's feet hit the cold, hard ground, her beautiful face turned ugly, and her elegant appearance gave way to a beast. The prince, realizing that he'd been tricked by the vizier, prayed to God to save his life, and his wish was granted when the beast suddenly turned on its heel, leaving him behind. As the Greek king's envious minister recited his story, he asked the king to heed this tale and remarked that Sage Ruyan could pull a simple trick at any time to harm the king, just as he'd easily healed his illness. The minister's plan was a success, and his venomous words slowly seeped into the king's blood. He immediately ordered the arrest of Sage Ruyan, having been convinced that he must be a spy for the enemy, sent on a mission to earn his trust, and then annihilate him. The king summoned Sage Ruyan to his court and announced that he was to be executed on this very day for espionage. The sage, realizing that the king was adamant in his intentions, begged the king for one last chance to go home and fetch a book. if he truly believed that the sage was a spy for the enemy, then this book would reveal the truth to him. The king agreed to grant his wish and ordered the guards to accompany him back home. The sage returned to the king's court with a thick book and asked the king to read a few pages of it. The king turned the pages of the book, surprised to see that they were blank. It suddenly dawned on him, too late, that he was already dead. The sage had poisoned the pages of the book, and the poison consumed the king's life, while at the same time saving his own. Back in the fisherman's world in the first episode of these stories, the fisherman recited this tale to the genie, explaining that if he hadn't wished for the death of the fisherman, then he wouldn't have to be imprisoned in a cask, about to be thrown into the sea. The genie begged one last time to be freed. However, whether he was freed or not remains a story to be told another day. The genie begged the fisherman to be freed, and after swearing to God that no harm would come to him, and after promising to reward the fisherman handsomely, the genie's wish was granted. A storm of sand manifested in the air and gave rise to a giant genie. With a grin, the genie ordered the shivering fisherman to follow him. They walked for a while, and as they came upon a small pond in the middle of a desert, the genie asked the fisherman to fish from the pond and to bring his catch to the king to receive a reward worthy of service. Soon after, the genie faded into nothingness, and the fisherman found himself alone. After doing as instructed, and after earning a generous amount of money from the king, the fisherman left for home with the sound of coins chinking in his pockets. In the meantime, the fish were delivered to the king's cook to be made into a delicious feast. However, as the fish were sizzling on a pan, a hole appeared in the wall, and a beautiful woman walked out. The cook fainted as the woman spoke with the fish and set fire to the pan, only to disappear back into the wall. Growing restless, the king sent for the fish and could not believe his ears when he heard the trembling cook explain what just transpired. Baffled, he ordered the fisherman to bring more fish tomorrow, and the fisherman obeyed. This time, the king himself waited in the kitchen to see if there was any truth to what the cook had explained. Much to his disbelief, the beautiful woman emanated from the wall once more and set fire to the pan after conversing with the fish. The king vowed to discover the mystery of these fishes and ordered the fisherman to show him where he caught them. Although the pond from which the fish were caught was located a close distance to the king's castle, surrounded by 4 mountains on all sides, he'd never seen it before. Convinced that there was more to this mystery than met the eye, the king decided to stake out the pond at night to see what transpired under the veil of darkness. As darkness shrouded the world, the king laid his eyes on a castle that had remained invisible in light. He approached the castle and, seeing that its doors were wide open, stepped foot inside. The castle was filled with all sorts of extravagances. Beautiful carpets were laid out throughout, and there existed a crystal pool adorned with faucets from which gold and jewelry flowed. Regardless, there was not a single soul in sight. The king was beginning to grow restless when he suddenly heard a faint sound. Following the sound, he came across a curtain, behind which the silhouette of a man could be seen. He slowly pushed the curtain aside, only to see a wailing young man with his back turned against the king. The king gave his regards to the man and asked who he was. But that is a story for another day.